Welcome to Democratic Television, a program of the Santa Clara County Democratic Party that brings insights, perspectives, and attitudes of our always thoughtful Democratic guests. Today we're joined by Shelia Bapat, a noted author, speaker, game changer, but you're going to learn all that in a few minutes from Shelia. Shelia, thanks for being on Democratic Television.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you are an author. I believe I see a book sitting there next to you.
Yes.
I'd like to talk about that. Your field of study was domestic workers, sort of an invisible population of workers that we don't always acknowledge and show respect for. But before we get there, let's get to know you a little bit. So where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Arizona, in the suburbs of Mesa, Arizona. My parents moved us there when I was about 7 years old, and it was a lovely place to grow up.
Hot?
Very hot. It's a dry heat, though.
Dry heat, so that's good.
Yes.
Did you have any interesting pets or subject matter in school that formed your core?
Yeah, no pets. Although I think we had a turtle that died after a day or something like that.
Yikes.
Yeah, but in school, absolutely. I think social studies, government was always my absolute favorite. I remember my senior year of high school taking an advanced placement government class that absolutely solidified my interest in social justice and policy and all of that stuff.
So, you hung out with the AP crowd?
I did.
Oh,
I did, yes.
They're good people.
They were. They all
guess.
have gone on to do great things. So.
So when you were growing up taking these classes, did you have any influential people in your life that maybe also helped make you who you are?
Absolutely. I think certainly my mom, her hard work as a caregiver in our household was very influential in my life. And, you know, I was always very aware of how much effort and work it was for her to parent my sister and myself, as well as, you know, work outside the home, which she did. And certainly teachers in my life really cultivated my interest in writing and civics classes and English classes and things like that. And as I got older, you know, it almost sounds tacky, but I think Gloria Steinem became one of the most important influences in my life. And we think of her as sort of an older second wave feminist, but I think her influence has really sustained.
Wow, and she's still very influential.
Yes. Very much so.
So after all those years in hot Arizona, where did you end up going to college? And
I stayed in Arizona for college. I went to the University of Arizona in Tucson, and that was a blast. It was just 4 years of fun, and you know, I was a political science major and studying everything that I was interested in, but also was close to family and just had a blast. And then I went off to law school, actually, at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and that was a huge contrast from Arizona, just in terms of weather and in terms of the seriousness of my peers in school. But that was a great experience as well, and that's where I began to focus on women's economic issues and employment issues specifically.
were those motives for you to want to get your law degree?
I think social justice was always the reason I went to law school. Certainly, I knew during law school that I wasn't there to practice law for very long, at least. I continued writing, and I was on journals and focused on, at that time, contraceptive coverage was heating up. Insurance coverage of contraceptives, it's still a big deal, as we know.
Very current comment.
It's still controversial, apparently, as the Hobby Lobby decision showed us a couple weeks ago. But so all of that sort of was cultivated while I was in law school.
So you are a writer. Again, there's the book. What made you want to write a book, and what made you think, I can do this?
Yeah. Well, so I've always been a writer in terms of, I was an editor of my college and high school newspapers, and in law school I was an editor of a journal. And so I always really enjoyed that process of crafting ideas and shedding light on issues that I think are important. I think, though, I started freelance writing about the domestic workers movement specifically about 2 years ago, and it struck me as such a triumphant story today. You know, most of the labor stories today are framed as tragic stories of, you know, low-wage work and unions being destabilized and unions crumbling and things like that. And this is really a movement that has been so successful in such a short period of time. And so I thought it was important to tell this as a triumphant story and really chronicle all of the activism that's happening right now. So I pitched 2 publishers. The first publisher, who shall remain nameless, rejected me within like 3 days. And the second publisher, IG Publishing in Brooklyn, New York, said yes, they would love to tell this story. And so we decided to write a book about the domestic workers movement in the United States.
Now, I don't know much about writing, but I think getting a second publisher to say yes is pretty amazing.
I'm still amazed by that as well. I think it was a combination of things for those out there who are interested in ever writing a book. I think it's really important to make sure that your topic is aligned really closely with what the publisher cares about. So doing a lot of research up front and making sure that you're pitching an idea that will be of interest to this publisher. You know, if you pitch something way out in left field, it's just not going to go anywhere. So I think that alignment was really close. IG Publishing is very focused on labor issues, progressive politics in general, women's issues. And this topic in particular has been so timely and important that they really seized on it. And it's been great. And there was certainly that feeling after I got the book deal of, oh my gosh, I have to do this now. I have to write a book. This was November of 2012. So, yeah.
So, and I want to talk about the content and domestic workers. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
But how do you write a book? Do you, wake up at 3 a.m.? What's the ritual? And what's the motivation besides coffee?
Yeah. The ritual is, for me, it was actually 5 a.m. Yeah, I really got disciplined about getting up right at 5 a.m. and just getting going and really putting words on paper is what it comes down to. Any writer will tell you that you can do all the thinking and all of the research in the world, but at the end of the day, you have to put words on a page. So I started back in the winter of 2012 by really making an outline of what's happening in the movement right now. That outline became my table of contents. And I just went from there. I worked on each chapter really rigorously. But I did have that morning ritual of 5 a.m. And, when you get up at 5, no one else is around.
That's for sure.
It's completely free time. It's your world for like 2.5 hours. So it's like a whole day of work, if you just focus those few hours. But that was really my ritual. And there is a coffee shop that opens at 5 a.m. right near my apartment in San Francisco.
Perfect.
And so I would just bring back coffee and I was all set.
There you go. Now your book has lots of footnotes in it, so you did do a lot of research, and I have obviously found that the footnotes gave a lot of credibility or an ability for people to get advanced information if they were specifically interested.
Exactly. I think that's where sort of the law degree rears its head in some ways, is you want to tell a story, but you also want to show that it's grounded in a lot of research, both theoretical and practical. And as I was writing, it was really important to me that this book be both accessible to students and things like that, and to other activists and progressives, but also really clear that there's law and policy that we're talking about, and that's what the activism is really achieving, is changes in policy. So it is a combination of narrative stories about workers and all the policy behind why their work matters.
It's a story about workers, but it's also a story about specific workers and maybe change agents or people who did precedent-setting stuff or said, I'm not going to take it anymore.
Right. That's exactly right. One of the things that the book does is it chronicles both domestic workers, nannies, caregivers, and housekeepers who work in private homes in the United States and throughout the world. And it chronicles advocates as well, like you said, attorneys and activists and community organizers throughout the country who have been critical to in making sure that domestic workers have someone to talk to, someone to get them out of exploitative situations, someone to represent them in their wage theft cases, as well as kind of holistic services and help getting out of, getting into better housing, things like that. And so the book really talks about both the workers and the value of their labor, as well as why these community organizers are so critical. I'm sure you remember back in 2008 when President Obama was running for president, and the Republicans really ridiculed him for having been a community organizer.
Right.
You remember that?
Right. Dirty word almost.
Yeah, it was a dirty word for them, and that doesn't surprise us, of course, but that really stuck with me from back in 2008. And, when I was researching for this book, it was so clear how critical community organizers really are. People who are working for agencies like Mujeres de Unidas in Oakland, California, or Adhikar in New York City, who are there kind of the first line of help for domestic workers and many other types of workers who are experiencing abuse.
Did you get a chance to meet a lot of domestic workers in doing the research?
I did. I would interview workers in person, many of whom began their lives as domestic workers in other countries and then came to the United States, and have gone on to lead agencies like Mujeres Unidas in Oakland. Juana Flores comes to mind as a really inspiring story. Yeah.
Well, you make a point in the book that talk about domestic workers having to work in many cases alone. They work in individual homes,
Right.
and they have some common characteristics of income, race, class, ethnicity, the whole
Right.
gamut. And
Right.
did that bring people together and have people go, well, we have a lot in common?
Well, I think exactly. I think, so the domestic work sector is, the vast majority is female, over 90%. We could probably say 99.9% is female in the United States and throughout the world. Mostly women of color, Latina women, African American women, a lot of Asian American women, and immigrants from all parts of the world who come to the United States. And there absolutely was this narrative among the advocates behind this movement that despite these very clear and considerable differences in culture, there was this unity that has begun to form because of the domestic workers movement, that all workers are worthy of dignity and basic protections. And so it is a very diverse movement in terms of the many cultures that are represented, but there is a lot of unity among these different groups. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, let's talk more about what you found in your work and your book and what you're doing now.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
Hello, my name is Margaret Abe Koga, and I'm a council member with the City of Mountain View. I'm sitting here today at KMBT in the studio. We just finished taping a segment of Democratic TV. And I wanted to talk with you about how you can get involved with the Democratic Party. When I was looking for a way to make a difference right after college, the Democratic Party was where I went to. And from there, I got involved with different groups and actually ended up starting a club myself called the Silicon Valley Asian Pacific American Democratic Club. And we've worked hard to try to get more people involved in the party, in the political process, helping to get good people elected to local government and in other political offices. And so it's a great place to go to if you're looking to get involved. So please call us if you want to help out in any way at 408-445-9500. or visit our website at www.sccdp.org. Thank you.
Welcome back to Democratic Television. We're having a great conversation with a noted author here. Shelia, that'd be you. What I wanted to talk about next was the whole world of domestic workers. Can you define what a domestic worker is? I mean, I think we all think we know.
Yeah. Domestic workers are nannies, housekeepers, caregivers for the elderly or disabled populations or ill populations who work inside of private homes. This is labor that is essential for all other labor that we do, making sure a home is clean or a child is cared for or an ill person is taken care of is the only way we can, those of us who go out into the world and work outside of the home can actually be able to do that, right? It's domestic labor is the work that makes all other work possible. There are an estimated 50 to 100 million domestic workers throughout the world. In the United States, somewhere between 2 and 3 million domestic workers. It's not always easy to nail down that exact number because it is such an invisible workforce in many cases.
But this includes in-home support service workers?
Yes.
So
yes, it does.
Folks that give life-saving care to people day in and day out.
Exactly.
Could you describe some of the working conditions that domestic workers deal with?
Yeah, there really are a range of circumstances and situations. And there are many domestic workers who are simply denied their wages. They go into a situation and they're promised, a monthly salary of $1,000 a month, plus stipends to travel and things like that. That's the promise that they come in the situation with, and often are simply denied any pay whatsoever. Often these are women who are from other countries, from Central American countries or Asian countries, who've come into the United States with the promise that they'll have a stable situation, and then they're trapped in a household. They're completely reliant on their employer, and they're not receiving any pay. So it ranges from things like wage theft, right? All the way up to things that would be considered a trafficking situation. Trafficking is much more exploitative. It requires, a showing that someone has been coerced to work without any pay. There's one woman profiled in the book named Shanti Gurung. She came to the United States at the age of 17 to work for Indian diplomats in New York City. She also is from India. And when she arrived to the United States, the promise was she'd earn $1,000 a month and live in this lovely Manhattan apartment and be paid, paid regularly. She was never paid. She was denied food. She was forced to sleep on the floor. When she moved to the United States, she weighed about 140 pounds. 3 years later, she was down to 87 pounds.
Wow.
She didn't know anyone else except her employers, and so eventually she was able to escape to a grocery store and, in panic, flagged down a woman she had met previously. And this woman was able to help her, but she fled. She had to flee the situation. And this is the story of many domestic workers in the United States and abroad. Thankfully, because of the activism that's chronicled in the book, and because of state legislators like Tom Amiano in California and Keith Wright in New York and many others throughout the country, this exploitative working conditions are now beginning to change, and domestic workers are slowly being included within basic labor protections, such as overtime, and minimum wage has been hard to enforce as well in this population, and it's beginning to be enforced.
And they weren't covered under the National Labor Relations Act
Right.
way back when.
Yeah.
Why was that? That seems unfair.
It's really an unfortunate story that's rooted in both racism and sexism and classism, rooted in all three. Back when President Roosevelt was fighting for his New Deal legislation in the 1930s, he was negotiating with Southern legislators who were still sort of getting used to the fact that slavery was no longer legal in this country and Reconstruction was important. It was a real cultural divide that President Roosevelt was dealing with at that time. And, Southern legislators basically demanded that domestic workers be excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as the National Labor Relations Act. Most domestic workers at that time were African American. And, the reason is very clear. It's actually discussed in the book. The legislative history of the New Deal legislation talks about the fact that Southern legislators didn't want African American workers to be on the same economic footing as white workers. So it's a really racist exclusion, and deeply unfortunate. We talk about how hard the Affordable Care Act has been for President Obama, and I think President Roosevelt was dealing with something even more challenging.
Well, you also mentioned in a book, which is really very helpful to understand this whole circumstance or situation, the work is kind of invisible work. Right. We think of it as women's work.
Right.
It should happen in the house, not as valued.
Exactly.
And yet so critical.
Exactly. There have been a number of feminist scholars, from Gloria Steinem to Selma James, who have talked about the fact that since we think of domestic work as women's work, as the private sphere, that it's just assumed that women will do this work for free. Now that other women are taking this work on and we've outsourced that labor to nannies and caregivers, we don't think that it's labor, right? We've been trained to sort of see it as freebie, right? It's essentially work that we expect someone will do for no pay or very little compensation.
So what has been the response of community-based organizations, community organizers, labor unions?
Yeah.
You talk about that in the book a little bit.
Yeah, I do. I really talk about sort of the birthplace of this modern movement over the last 10 years or so as being New York City. There is a noted activist, really ostensibly the leader of the domestic workers movement, named Ai-jen Poo, a very impressive young woman who she was organizing survivors of domestic violence in New York in the late 90s. And she observed that many of these survivors of domestic violence were domestic workers. And, if we could improve the economic conditions of domestic workers, we could help them get out of violent situations so they could be economically independent. And so she shifted over to focus specifically on domestic workers. She, along with, a movement is never just one person, as we know, and so there have been so many activists throughout the country, mostly all women of color, which is what makes this movement so extraordinary, who have been advocating for changes to labor policy to include domestic workers within basic labor protections. And, it's been a really national organizing effort. The activity in New York certainly spread over to California. New York became the first state to enact domestic workers legislation in 2010, and California followed suit in 2013. The road was much rougher here in California, and we can talk a little bit about that if you want.
Well, let's do that.
Yeah.
Why was it so?
So in 2006, the California state legislature actually passed domestic workers legislation that would include all domestic workers in California within overtime protections, or at least most domestic workers within overtime protections. Governor Schwarzenegger at that time vetoed the legislation. And we also know that he, years prior, had fathered a child with his housekeeper, with his domestic worker.
Yep.
And when I went on a book tour, I tell that story, and I don't shy away from that story because of kind of the hypocrisy of vetoing legislation at the same time he, had fathered a child with his domestic worker. I think that story crystallizes the power dynamic that many domestic workers are dealing with when they work inside of homes. And, we should be very critical of our leadership in terms of how are they treating the workers in their own lives and how are they, treating our policy as well. So 2006, that was vetoed. In 2012, there was a big campaign for domestic workers legislation. It was really robust legislation that included overtime, stronger benefits across the board. And the belief was that Governor Jerry Brown would sign the legislation, and sadly he vetoed it in 2012. It was a big blow to the domestic workers movement. So it's been a struggle, but happily in 2013, Governor Brown finally signed overtime legislation. He was not thrilled about it. He sort of felt like he had to do it. And, you know, the domestic workers who advocated for the legislation came to the signing of the bill. He barely spoke with them, he barely acknowledged them. But despite that, all the workers and activists who arrived surrounded Governor Brown and thanked him after he signed the legislation.
Wow, overly gracious.
I think so, but he's now sort of come to, you know, he's talking to them more and he's building better relationships with this group. But it was a rough road in California, something we wouldn't have expected.
So people watching may know of circumstances where people are being exploited or not getting access or time off.
Right.
Where would they go? We have just a few minutes left.
Oh, great.
What do you do?
So there are some important resources. The first I'll say is Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Association. It's a national group. They're based in the East Bay. Hand in Hand is a great group to look for resources and as a place to go for workers who need help. Caring Hands is another one in the Bay Area that advocates for domestic workers and is aware of all the protections that workers should have. And there's a few others, but I'll stop with Hand in Hand and Caring Hands as resources people can look to.
So this is the book, Part of the Family, great title. If people want to get hold of you or learn more about this, where would you suggest they go?
Well, I am very active on Twitter. Actually, as a writer, I find that it's a great way to dialogue with other writers. So it's just my handle is just at Shelia Bapat, and it's a great way to get conversations started. And I certainly hope that people enjoy the book. Is
it available online? Is it on those big places?
Yes. The Part of the Family, my book, is available on Amazon, and it's also on my publisher's website. If you go to igpub.com, that's igpub.com. It's right there.
Great. Thanks for watching Democratic Television. Give us a call at 408-445-9500 or visit our website at www.sccpdp.org. Thank you.
I'm United States Senator Barbara Boxer. Thank you for watching Democratic Television.